Hello, good afternoon, Dr. Johnson. This is Jacob Scheibe doing a video reflection for reflection number 1 in culturally responsive teaching. To just jump into the first question, what did you read that brought you the most intellectual satisfaction and why? For me personally, that would be the different levels of culture, the sort of schema that were discussed, including the surface level, shallow level, and deep level of culture. Although I have had conversations and reflections and thoughts about culture in the past, I'd never really considered the schema. I really sort of viewed culture only at the surface level, where it's like the very visible differences between myself and the students that I teach. So the way we talk, the language we use, the food that they eat, the clothing they wear. And I never really considered some of those deeper cultural differences, things that sort of that impact the way that my students interpret the world versus how I interpret the world, and how that can manifest in the classroom, especially when it comes to things like just being to class on time. We view those very differently. Very commonly throughout the school, many of our students will be showing up 20 to 30 minutes late, and it's not really that big of a deal to them. It's because the start of class is more like a suggestion, because they think that as long as they're getting the main chunk of content, they're able to have successfully completed the lesson for the day. Whereas teachers on our end, we get a little, or at least me personally, I don't know about the other teachers, but me personally, I get a little more frustrated at the tardiness because they've missed a chunk of content. Even though it might not have been the most important aspect of what we were learning for the day, it very well could have been the sort of hook or the real world connection that I was trying to make to sort of lure them in with the do now activity and things. So just the way that those different cultural aspects impact the classroom was really just very, very intellectually satisfying to read about, because I learned about a lot of different strategies and ways to leverage their own culture in the classroom, and how I can ensure that even though there are cultural differences among us, the best way for me to accommodate those cultural differences and continue to improve my own practice as a teacher. Thinking about what the second question here, what within the readings is frustrating or troubling for you? For me personally, as I was reading about this sort of like the warm defender chart and the 4 different aspects of the like categories on that chart, that was a little frustrating for me to read, because I realized like, at least in my first year of teaching, I myself was not one of those. Was I saying defender? I meant demander. The warm defender. I myself was not being a very warm defender my first year of teaching. I leaned a lot more into the category that was described as the technocrat, which was basically you're well liked, but there's a professional distance between yourself and your students, where you understand the content well, you can relate to students, and you make your lessons engaging and exciting because the teacher themselves are interested in the content and can find ways to make the students interested. But there really was not like a deeper connection on a personal level between the teacher and the student. And I personally think in my first year of teaching, I fell into that category as this sort of technocrat, because I came in as this, inexperienced and culturally pretty different teacher from the student population. So although I was able to keep my students somewhat engaged, there was always that professional distance between the two, me and my students, really. And heading into my second year now of teaching, I've been working on, before I actually read this chart, I realized I've been pushing myself more toward this warm demander category, trying to get away from the technocrat, while I still am very excited and motivated to teach, U.S. government, because I myself am very interested in the subject. I'm trying to build more personal relationships with the students, so that when I do ask them to meet these high expectations that I've set, they themselves have more intrinsic motivation of like, okay, I have a connection with this person, this teacher now, and they wouldn't be asking me to engage in this, critical thinking activity if it wasn't beneficial for myself and my own development as a learner and student. So I've been working on that without really much guidance. And until I saw this chart and the different strategies that sort of break down, here's what you can do to become more of a warm demander of your students. I was doing my best to push myself toward that. Just as an example, my students would tell me about different things that they wanted me to try or look at or review. And I would do them. Last year, I would not do those things. I would just say, "Oh, that's interesting. Maybe I'll sometime get around to it," but never really get around to it. But now, in the moments where they bring those things up, I'll almost immediately do those things to try and build a connection between us. And establishing those relationships early and quickly with them really does help when I ask them to do something more critical and demanding. So it puts me more toward that warm demander category now, but I'm still working on it. I still personally think I am more of the technocrat. Um, but I'm doing the things I think hopefully that will push me toward being a warm demander. The third question, what within the readings initiated newfound curiosity? For me, it was really reading kind of more about the hard science aspect of like the brain chemistry and things that are actually happening in your brain when you're learning and interacting and in a school environment. In my undergrad of college, I studied, the liberal arts. I was a history major and justice studies major. So, and education is really kind of tied to justice studies a lot. So some of the concepts, although they're new and very new to me, I have learned some of them previously, but I never really got into the sort of hard science of like brain chemistry and how the brain actually works in these certain social situations. And I was really interested in sort of the section where they went over the three main sections, like the hippocampus, the amygdala, and it was the RAS system, the RAS system, which sort of assessed for threats. It's kind of that reptilian part of your brain. And now, although we're not living previously where we'd have these physical threats of like a predator might attack us, the classroom sometimes can stimulate those same responses in a variety of ways, which I thought was very just interesting to read about. And it developed this new curiosity in me where it's like how there might be situations where I as a teacher am triggering those fight or flight responses just by the words I'm using or the way I'm acting or the way that I'm interacting one-on-one with the student. So I really want to be more aware of those situations and the things I can do to minimize those for the students, especially when it comes to microaggressions. I know the reading mentioned those and how sometimes you don't even notice you might say or do something and it might impact a student. And they themselves might not consciously process it right away, but as they reflect on it, they might say, that did irk me, and it might push me into more of this fight or flight response where now instead of being receptive and responsive, I'm more reactive and I'm not going to volunteer as much. So just keeping those things in mind and really just learning more about the physical side, the hard science of like brain chemistry and how it operates in the classroom. I found that very interesting, especially because it was something I'd never really considered before. And it's definitely something I'm going to work into my practice of how can I minimize microaggressions? How can I minimize that fight or flight response and keep students engaged and not reactive? The fourth question, what affirmed or challenged your previous perspectives or beliefs? Something that really affirmed one of my beliefs was the value and the importance of good feedback for students. Feedback was something I never my own background coming into teaching. It cringes me to think about it sometimes just because heading into my first year in the classroom just last year with no educational training, I went through a lot of bumps in the road. And one of those was feedback where a student would submit something and I would just say, good job, or, retry this question. And that was like the extent of my feedback. And then if they asked me a follow-up question, I would try to help guide them through it. But now after reading about the importance of feedback, especially when it comes to some of these other things, like if a student asks you for support, how can you provide feedback that isn't just giving them the answer, but is pushing them to think and continue to challenge themselves mentally? So that's something that I personally really, really wanted to that kind of affirm my belief in the importance of feedback, because I knew I wasn't doing it well last year in my first year. And it's something that I really wanted to re-emphasize this year was how can I provide that better feedback for my students? Thinking about the fifth question, consider your students who might benefit the most from what you've learned in the course readings and how. I think about when they went over in chapter 1, the independent versus dependent learners. I think that my dependent learners are going to really benefit the most from my new approach to teaching after taking this course and reading the textbook and implementing these practices, because heading into my first year and even someone in my second year, because I'm teaching US government and it's supposed to be a 12th grade course, I usually go in with the assumption that most of my students at this point are independent learners, or they are about to become independent learners because they're reaching that age of adulthood. But that is a disservice to some of my students because they haven't reached that point yet. And so in terms of their like proximal development, I am putting them in a place where they just can't meet the expectations. So for me now, where I have these strategies where I can assist those dependent learners, put certain scaffolds in place, and provide them better guidance and really just better teaching strategies, I think it's going to help benefit them the most in the long term, because of the various strategies that I can now implement to assist them. Number 6, consider your coworkers who might benefit the most from what you've learned in the course readings. Thinking about my coworkers, I feel like the veteran teachers on the social studies team, because that's mostly who I work with, would probably benefit the most because a lot of them kind of get stuck in, I want to say, old school methods of teaching where they've been teaching for so long now. Like I think about the teacher right next to me and the one I work with the most, the economics teacher. He's been teaching for 22 years now, and he's really just kind of set in his ways. His practice is not going to change or evolve. And this is just from conversations I've had with him. He's like, I've been doing this for so long. I have a system that works. I consistently am performing above, the district averages. But if he were willing to implement some of these strategies, I think his scores would be able to improve even further, especially when it comes to things like feedback. He's very well liked, but he is also sort of a technocrat like I am, where he's very well engaged with the content and very well versed in it and can make it interesting. But there's still that professional distance between him and the students. And it's kind of interesting because we have the same background culturally. We're both white men who are straight and have grown up in sort of similar situations. So I could see myself, if without like always working on my practice, I could see myself very easily just staying in teaching forever, kind of finding, the sweet spot that works kind of in the way he did and never evolving my practice any further. So I feel like these types of teachings and readings could most benefit veteran teachers, like the econ teacher that I work with so much. But so I think in our PLCs, I might mention some of these different strategies and things, and we'll see how that goes. But you never know. Sometimes the veteran teachers can take the advice of newer teachers and implement those things. So we'll see. Number 7, how will you apply what you've read in the classroom? I know for me personally, I'm going to try to implement a lot of the sort of protocols that they have discussed throughout the readings. One of the big ones for me would be the asset-based feedback protocol that was discussed. I know for me that there are some students that I still sort of struggle connecting with, and I don't know if it's me personally. I never really had a strategy to address when a student wasn't connecting with me very well. It sort of just turned into like, we both need to be here and we'll just interact as least as possible as we can, unless you're like raising your hand or you're falling behind in coursework. So using this sort of asset-based feedback protocol, I now have a strategy of, okay, I'm not connecting very well with the student. What are some intentional steps that I can take as a teacher to develop that relationship and not just ignore it, sort of like I did previously, because the onus is on the teacher as the professional and the adult in the room to really develop those relationships with the students, because they're there to learn and they're still in the process of growing and working on communication skills. So it should be on the adult, which is me, setting up those feedback and meetings and really figuring out why we weren't connecting very well and things of that nature. And there's a particular student I can think of right now that I want to try this with, coming back after spring break, because we've just never connected very well. And they frequently have behavioral issues and aren't always turning in great work. But when they are able to focus, they're one of my highest performing students. So I definitely want to implement some of these protocols to try and improve my relationship with them and try to push them into sort of leveling up and becoming a better version of themselves. And then finally, number 8, what are my final thoughts on this topic? I know for me personally, I was actually having a conversation with my coworkers before spring break where we were talking about kind of teaching on autopilot. And it's something I've never experienced yet. And it's probably just because I'm on my only in my second year. But some of the veteran teachers are like, by this time of the year, they're just teaching on autopilot, using old lessons, teaching old content, and the days just kind of like can really just clip by for them really, really quickly. Whereas for me, I feel like I exert a ton of energy every day and I'm like teaching to the maximum. And I come home very, very tired sometimes, especially on Mondays in that Monday class. But anyway, I've never understood how some of these teachers are able to teach on autopilot. But if I ever get to that point where I feel like I'm just teaching on autopilot, I would hopefully be able to pull myself back in and say, that's not a great way to be an effective teacher because you always have new classes. There's always new methodologies coming out. There's always new strategies being implemented that can help improve the classroom and help students reach their fullest potential. And reading this book, especially the Hammond book, has really opened my eyes to that, just how the different culturally responsive strategies that you can implement in your classroom to help your students reach that fullest potential. So just thinking about that conversation before spring break about teaching on autopilot and just making sure that if I ever reach that point, I'm able to kind of check myself and then dive back into educational literature and improve my practice and make sure that even if the job gets easier as time goes on, which is to be expected, I'm still pushing myself to get better and pushing my students to reach that fullest potential. So I believe that will wrap up my reflection, and thank you for listening.